Hello and welcome, everyone. Oh, I am so excited. So, I have to tell you how we came to this point. Last February, during Black History Month, we featured some amazing people, members of our own community, and highlighted the great things that they have done in the city, in the county, and they were all Black people. And I'm so excited. African American history is not just African American history, it's history. And so we're excited because after we looked at week after week after week after week, 4 weeks of highlighting four great people, we were like, we're over. It would take us forever to continue all the great people. So we decided, our team decided to highlight African Americans in our community every month for the year. So we are excited. Mr. Hearns is our first one, and we're going to get this party started. I'm excited. My name is Angela Fullwood, and I am with the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion under the FACE Department, Family and Community Engagement. And with me, I have my illustrious leader, Dr. Felita Lewis. She is the Executive Director for Family and Community Engagement, and she is going to introduce our first guest today.
You're muted. And Mr. Hearns, we thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Ms. Fullwood, for that wonderful introduction. And so we are happy to launch the 2021 and 2022 Black History Spotlight Series with Mr. Hearns. So I would like to take this moment to introduce him to our community and our participants on the call today. So Mr. Hearns was born in the Bronx, New York, and grew up in Tampa, Florida. A graduate of George S. Middleton High School, he earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of South Florida. He worked as a reporter for several newspapers in Florida and as a sports information director at Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Mr. Hearns was hired in 1975 to work for the executive assistant to the Tampa's mayor, Alton White, and worked for the city for 32 years. He retired in 2007 as director of the Department of Community Affairs. Mr. Hearns launched the Fred Hearns Tours, LLC in 2007, which offers custom guided tours of Tampa, Florida's most historic neighborhoods. And we had a unique opportunity to engage in one of those tours with him this past summer with other district level leaders, community members, and school board members. Mr. Hearns holds a master's degree from Springfield College, Human Services, and from the University of South Florida, Africana Studies, and currently is a candidate for the PhD in anthropology at the University of South Florida. And I can't wait to call you doctor. And so Mr. Hearns is also the father of 4 adult children and has 5 grandchildren. So we present to you tonight, Mr. Fred Hearns, to share his story. And I thank you for being a local pioneer and trailblazer in the greater Tampa Bay area community, Mr. Hearns. I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lewis and Angela, and I certainly want to thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this program. This is a wonderful thing that you're doing. Anytime we can tell our stories that often are not told as often as they should be, because our children need to understand from whence they came. Good understanding of the past will enlighten the future for you. And that's really true. And I want to agree with something that Ms. Fullwood said a little earlier. African-American history is not just African-American history, it's history. And I guess you could say another way to say that is history made by African Americans is history. So I can say that several years ago, after I retired and I decided to start Fred Hearns Tours, LLC, and I did bus tours and walking tours for over 13 years. When I started out, my initial plan was to do Black History bus tours. So I'm going to think about, and growing up in Tampa, I knew a lot of sites, but then I read and read and read everything I could find that had anything to do with Tampa history. And what I discovered is that it was almost impossible to segregate out Black history from Tampa history. It's all mixed in together with Cuban history, the history of the Spanish immigrants who came here, the Sicilians, the people from the Bahamas who came here, and from many other places in the United States. So my title is Black History Curator for the Tampa Bay History Center. We agreed that it should be a Black title as opposed to an African-American title, which sort of restricts you to Black people born here in America or who identify themselves as Americans, because we know there are many Black people among us from different countries and different continents even. So the one thing we do have in common is our Blackness, our beautiful Blackness. And so thank you again for inviting me.
Well, thank you for being with us. We're so excited. So as we attempt to really gain some more knowledge and understanding of who you are, could you tell us a little bit more about positions in Tampa and how those roles impact what you do today?
Okay, well, as was mentioned, I started out as a newspaper reporter. My very first job was working for C. Blythe Andrews, Sr. and Jr. at the Florida Sentinel Bulletin newspaper. I was actually Mr. Andrews Jr.'s neighbor. I lived right down the street from him on Cayuga Street in East Tampa, just 2 blocks away from the original Middleton High School. And so I would see him often in the neighborhood. And one day I said to him that I thought I'd like to write for the newspaper. So it was my summer job. It's actually how I paid my way through USF as an undergrad, working for the Florida Sentinel Bulletin. And so it was a wonderful experience. I was a very introverted young man, very shy, but you can't be shy and be an effective newspaper reporter. You've got to learn how to address people. You've got to learn how to talk to folk, look them in the eye, sometimes not get the kind of responses that you wanted. And so that shyness quickly went away once I became a reporter. And I did that for a few years after I graduated from USF. As was mentioned, I did go to Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I worked there 4 years in the public contacts office. That was my HBCU experience. And let me just say to our students out there who may be listening, or parents who may be listening, if your child does not have an HBCU experience at some point during their educational journey, they're going to miss out on something that nothing else can replace. I wouldn't trade, I'm a Jaguar. I never took a class at Southern University, but I'm a Southern University Jaguar. So when I see all the Rattler love and all the Wildcat love, I understand it, because there you go. Because there's something inside of you that's just a little bit different that I didn't get at USF. USF was a great experience. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world, but I wouldn't trade my HBCU experience for anything in the world either. So came back home one Christmas and congratulated Alton White, who had been appointed the first executive assistant to the mayor of the city of Tampa. This was 1974. And out of the clear blue sky, Alton said, "Fred, I got a job for you. I want you to come and work for the city." And without even thinking, I immediately said, "Yes, I'll do it." I hadn't talked to my wife. I hadn't talked to the people I worked for at Southern. I mean, it was just a no-brainer. And so I came back home for the next 32 and a half years. I worked for the city of Tampa. I saw a lot of changes in the city. My God, people living here in the 70s and 80s would not know this city today. So that was a wonderful experience. I retired as human rights director for the city of Tampa. And what I did in that role was we investigated discrimination complaints in employment, housing, public accommodations filed against employers within the city limits and businesses within the city limits of Tampa. So I reviewed some 2,000 complaints during my career with the city. So when people talk about discrimination and racism, I saw it up close every day with the complaints and the complainants that we worked with. So after that, I couldn't just sit down and do anything. I mean, I tried it for a couple of months and I was going nuts, just, roaming around the house. So I started Fred Hearns Tours. Again, it was a wonderful experience. I learned so much. Every time I do a tour, I learned something from the people on the tour. The day that we were out at Perry Harvey Park, I picked up some knowledge from some folk there who had some memories. Mr. Washington was reminding me about the Longshoreman Hall. And he had longshoremen in his family, and I had longshoremen in my family too. So, I mean, there's just so much history all around us. We walk past it, we drive past it every day. And sometimes there are signs that bring it to our attention. Sometimes there are not signs. So that's where the tours came in. And I love doing those tours. As it happened, I did my last tour a week before COVID pretty much shut down the city of Tampa. So I had planned on stopping the tours in anyway. So for the next year and a half, there were no tours at all. But now I am occasionally doing tours upon special requests through the Tampa Bay History Center. And as you know, Angela, with our Hillsborough County African American History Task Force and some other groups I'm associated with. So I still do tours occasionally, and I love it.
I can tell you love it. You're so knowledgeable and clear, concise. You showed us a lot of great information. Could you just share one of your favorite items on the walking tour that you share? What's one of your favorite to share?
Well, one of the stories that I love to tell is the story about Moses White. Moses White is one of the 7 people featured in a special section, our Legends section in Perry Harvey Park. And there is a 6-foot image of Moses White in the middle of that display. Moses White was a businessman who owned 4 different businesses on Central Avenue during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. By the way, Central Avenue began to turn into something different from what we'd always known in June of 1967, when we had the death of 19-year-old Martin Chambers in the Central Park Village area. Several buildings were burned down over the next 3 or 4 evenings. People began to move out of Central Avenue. At that time, desegregation opened up restaurants and clubs and places, movie theaters that Black folk previously could not go to. And so we didn't have to go to Central Avenue anymore. And so as a result, the businesses died out. That was the beginning of the end. But Moses White was voted by his peers, the other business owners on Central Avenue, the mayor of Central Avenue. He was the man you went to. He was sort of like the godfather of Central Avenue. He was the man you went to if you needed help, if you wanted to start a business and you wanted to know where you could borrow money. Moses White actually loaned James Brown the money that James Brown made his first recording with. James Brown was just starting out, as an entertainer in the 50s. And he had a little bit of money, but he had never recorded a record. And Moses White loaned him the money to go to Cincinnati and record. Anybody know what his first record was? I know you guys are too young to know this. Please, Please, Please. That was James Brown's first recording. If you saw the movie that came out a few years ago about the life of James Brown, that part of the movie was true. That was the first record. But of course, the movie didn't mention Moses White, but we know that Moses White bankrolled James Brown to get him started. Then later on, one of Moses's sons wound up being James Brown's bodyguard. And another son wound up being his manager for a while. I can remember in the 1960s, James Brown coming back to Tampa every year, especially during the summer, to do a concert at the Fort Homer Hesley Armory which is now the Jewish Community Center on Howard Avenue in West Tampa. I never missed the James Brown concert. Whenever he came to Tampa, he was the godfather. And so we have a lot of people who knew James Brown personally. Senator Arthenia Joyner is one of them, because when he would come to Tampa, he spent time at the Cotton Club, which was owned by her parents. So Moses White's story, I mean, I could go on and on about Mr. White. He also has a bronze bust on the Riverwalk. I think all of us at one time or the other have been down the Riverwalk, at least a portion of it. There are 30 bronze busts on the Riverwalk. 9 of those people are Black people. And Moses White is one of those people who has a bust on the Riverwalk. He also has a public housing area in North Tampa named for him. Moses White Estates, I believe it's called. And also that portion of Main Street from North Boulevard, from Blake High School, going west all the way down to Armenia is named Moses White Boulevard. So Moses White's name is gonna live for a long time here in Tampa, and rightfully so, because he helped a lot of people. He never wanted to take credit for anything that he did. And again, his son, my role model, my idol, Alton White.
And is Alton White related to Moses White? Is that one of his sons, correct?
Yes, Alton is the oldest son.
Oldest son.
He may be the oldest child, but I know he's the oldest son. Alton died a few years ago, unfortunately, and we lost a great, great man, because Alton White could have been a multi-millionaire had he chosen to do so. A lot of doors were open to him. He decided to stay in Tampa, his hometown, and he took jobs that he was really overqualified. Every job Alton ever had, he was overqualified for it. But he loved this city, and he stayed here and made a difference in the lives of a lot of people, and I'm one of them.
That's great. Thank you so much. Now, you talked about when you worked for Mr. White and with the city of Tampa. You talked about some complaints that you had to take in. What can you just share with us maybe one of the most egregious ones, one of the ones that you felt like was the worst, and what were some of the outcomes of your work?
Well, let me mention one early complaint. Actually, we were taking complaints before we even had a local ordinance. We did not have a human rights ordinance in the early 1970s when we began doing this work. But I remember one day a young man came to our office. Our office was on Nebraska Avenue in Tampa Park Plaza at the time, young African-American man, and he said, I applied for an apartment in Hyde Park. He said, and there was a little old white lady who came to the door when I knocked on the door. She had a sign up, apartment for rent. And she looked at me and she said, I don't rent the colors. I don't rent the colors, is what she said to him. And so he said, so that ended the conversation. I didn't get a chance to ask her how much or, what size room. He said, okay, ma'am, he left. But somebody told him that there was a place he could go and file a complaint, a fair housing complaint. We have had a federal fair housing law since 1968. This was around 1976. So the law had been on the books for some 8 years. So he came to our office, he spoke to me, and he explained just what I just repeated to you. And so at that time, our director said, well, go out to the address. We had the address, and see what happens, see what she says to you. Check it out. Now, mind you, we didn't have an ordinance, so we really couldn't do any enforcement. We were doing voluntary compliance in some cases. So I went out to the address. I went up to the house. I knocked on the door. Little old lady came to the door, white lady. And I said, ma'am, I'm here to, the sign was still up. I'm here to rent a room. And you know what she said to me? I don't rent the colors. The exact words the young man had repeated to me. I remember that like it was yesterday. And this was 1976. That's the impact of racism and discrimination when it applies to us personally. It became personal to me that day. a year before then, I was just doing a job. I was learning the ropes and, trying to find out if this was something that I could enjoy doing for a career. That day, it became personal. So that's one case that I remember. But then we had several other cases that we settled through mediation. Whenever someone filed a complaint, we always would offer the option to the complainant and to the respondent to go to mediation. And so we settle a lot of cases that way. I'll never forget one young man whose family we all know, and he took this job. He actually left the job. He was lured away from the job that he had to go to work for a nonprofit here in Tampa. And he worked there for, I guess, about a year and a half. And then suddenly there were some issues with fundraising. They were complaining that he was not an effective fundraiser. I'm not even sure that was explained to him that that was part of his job when he took the position. But and so they wound up firing him because he not raised enough money. He didn't bring in enough money. And so he came to our office, filed a complaint. We had a successful mediation. And so he walked away with a check. He didn't get the job back. He really didn't want to go back to work there, but he did get a financial settlement. And I think it was something that the nonprofit needed to be aware of, that there are consequences for your treatment of individuals when you expect things of them that they were not informed would be part of the requirements for the job. They hadn't told him he was going to be a fundraiser. And to be honest, what they should have done was surrounded him with experienced fundraisers and let him do the job he was hired for. So that was probably in the mid 80s, I would say, late 80s when that happened. A personal friend of mine who I see and his family quite often, but racism and discrimination is something that Derek Bell said many years ago, and people disputed him. He said, it's permanent. It's always going to be here. Well, nobody wants to think that there's no cure, that we will always have racism, that we will never have a society in which people are treated fairly. But that's what critical race theory says. And, that's a hot button now. When people talk about critical race theory, folk want to start the Civil War over again. But I don't want to believe that racism will always be here, but I'm still waiting to see evidence that that's not the case. I haven't seen enough evidence yet to convince me that Derek Bell is wrong.
Yes. That is a great, it is an important topic. And history shows that African-American people still continue to overcome we still overcome a lot of obstacles and barriers. Could you talk about, if you will, some of the ways that you have successfully, because you have successfully overcome some of your own adverse situations?
Yes, I'll be happy to. I can just say that, from an early age, I realized that I could get along with just about everybody. The color of somebody's skin was never an impediment to me to think that I could do whatever they're doing, and I can, be as good at whatever they're doing as anybody else, that I could blend in without selling out. That I could blend in without selling out. Now, going to USF in the 1960s, you could count the number of Black students. I think my freshman year in 1966, there were maybe 25 full-time Black students who I knew. I mean, we pretty much all knew each other. And the Black students would meet on the west patio of the UC, which is now the Marshall Center, every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. And we just talk about what was going on in life, Vietnam War, and there were a lot of things going on. It was just before Martin Luther King was assassinated. And the white students who were my friends, many of them, and Cubans and, some other folk whose skin was much lighter than mine, we got a chance to talk about a lot of things that I probably would not have had an opportunity to talk about had I not been in a diverse environment. That was a positive for me because I'd never gone to school with white students, had never sat next to white students, had one white teacher in high school. So I learned that you can get along with folk. First of all, people respect you if you know what you're talking about. They have to. They may not like you, but they're going to have to respect you if you know what you're talking about. So read, 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 study, 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 travel, travel, travel. I mean, all of that broadens us because we can't live in a vacuum. We can't operate well in a vacuum. So if you're going to get along in this world, and this is the only world that I know anything about, you're going to have to be able to maneuver such that people respect you and that you're fair-minded and that you have a short memory, because there are some things I've had to forget in order to move forward. You know, can't let things tug you down, because there are going to be some folk who, regardless of what you do, they're going to try to put stumbling blocks in the way. Keep your eye on the prize. Keep your eye on the prize and study history, because there's nothing new in the world. They may have a different cloak, but there's really nothing new in the world. So again, I come back to what I said in the first part of this discussion. The more history we know, the better we will be in a position to deal with the future and the present. So there's nothing special about me. I just kind of figured out some things, made a lot of mistakes along the way, try not to make the same mistake twice, and just keep moving forward.
Thank you for that. Now, if you have any questions for Mr. Hearns, go ahead and ask in the chat. What would you say to those people who don't see the relevance in celebrating? Because this is what our department is about, just celebrating the richness, the history, the people who, some who have deceased, but their families come on and we get the opportunity to speak with you. What would you say to those who don't see the relevance in celebrating the accomplishments of those who came before us, who kind of paved the way for us to have these opportunities that we have now?
Yeah, we have to do that. It's very important. We can't take anything for granted. You know, my high school, George S. Middleton High School, was named for a very special man, just to give you an example. And a lot of folk don't know much about Mr. Middleton. I confess that when I was a student, all I knew was the name. I didn't even know his first name was George. I just knew I went to Middleton High School. Okay, George Schroeder Middleton, let me tell you who this man was. And there were other giants in Tampa in the early 1900s. You know, he worked with Booker T. Washington. He brought Booker T. Washington, he chaired a committee that brought Booker T. Washington to Tampa in 1912, where Mr. Washington gave a speech on the grounds of what is now the University of Tampa. Booker T. Washington was the first Black man to draw a large crowd of Black and white people in the same room at the same time. George S. Middleton chaired that committee. George S. Middleton, after he lost his job under the Wilson administration, President Woodrow Wilson, he lost his job along with countless other African Americans who worked for the federal government. George S. Middleton was a mail carrier. And so what did he do after he lost that job? He went into the insurance business, like a lot of African Americans did, went into the insurance business. But he not only went into the insurance business, he became the secretary treasurer of Central Industrial Insurance Company, which became Central Life Insurance Company, working under the presidency at one time of Mary McLeod Bethune. And so George S. Middleton worked with Ms. Bethune. Not only that, in 1916, George Middleton was part of the Florida State Fair Negro Committee. I mean, I even remember growing up in the 1960s, we still had Negro Day at the Florida State Fair. That was the day Black people got to go to the fair. And white kids had another day they went. I mean, this was part of the culture. that I grew up here in Tampa. But George S. Middleton could have walked around and said, well, woe is me. I mean, if things were not equal in the 1960s, you can imagine what they were like in 1916. George S. Middleton, again, worked with the committee that brought Dr. W.B. Du Bois to Tampa. And W.B. Du Bois gave a speech on Central Avenue at the Odd Fellows Hall. And then they took him out for Spanish food in Ybor City. I mean, George S. Middleton was somebody. And this is the man for whom that school is named for. And so we've been trying to lift up his name and what he stood for ever since, the alumni have. So, I mean, that's just one person. Blanche Armwood and many, many others. We don't have time to go into just some really special people. One name I do want to mention before we run out of time, Hilda Turner, Turner Bartels. At one time, the school was named only for her, and now Bartels is part of that name. People need to know that it was Hilda Turner. Every employee of the Hillsborough County School District should know it was Hilda Turner who signed the lawsuit in 1941 for equal pay for Black teachers. Black teachers were making $60 a month. White teachers were making $90 a month. Hilda Turner signed her name on the dotted line on a lawsuit. NAACP represented her. The suit was won, but Hilda Turner pretty much had to leave Hillsborough County. She went to Chicago, where she taught until she retired. Then she came back home to Tampa and she died here. So whenever you think about that school, Turner Bartels, we need to know the sacrifice that she made. She knew what was going to happen if she signed that lawsuit. She did it anyway. That's part of our history.
That is amazing. And even listening to the history of Middleton, because both my parents attended Middleton. They met at Middleton. And my dad has pictures. I just saw some pictures of him at the fair with his grandmother, who took him to Negro Day at the fair. So it's him and his cousins that my great grandmother, it was his grandmother. My great grandmother took him to Negro Day at the fair, and he has his they all have their cowboy hats, but that picture was taken. It has on their Negro Day. It has on their Negro Day at the fair on the back of the picture. So, and he was maybe 8 years old. He's 76 now. So wow. Yeah, it's during this time, like, people are still living through that. So I know all of that is true. So we do have a question in the chat, because one of the parents says that there are 2 predominantly Black Boy Scout troops here in Tampa, and they want to get Mr. Hearns to share his vast knowledge with the young men and their families via a walking tour. How can someone book that walking tour?
We have regular walking tours in Perry Harvey Park that Ursula Odom does for the Tampa Bay History Center. But I can do special tours in addition to what Ursula does. Let me give out our phone number. Tampa Bay History Center, 813-228-0097. 813-228-0097. And my email address is fhearns, Hearns is spelled HEARNS, at tampabayhistorycenter.org. So you can call me or you can send me an email, and we will put you in touch with our education department, which really manages the tours. Or if it's something that I can do, we'll work something out. So contact us and let us know.
Thank you for that. Okay, and as we're winding down, if there are not any more questions, if you have any more questions, go ahead. Oh, yeah, I think we have one. They're just saying, as a member of the National Council of Negro Women, thank you, Fred, for the history of Hilda Turner, the history of why the school is named after her. Thank you. So we do appreciate that. growing up in Tampa, that's one of the things that I've now become passionate about. That was our, 2 of our 4 sessions in February, our Black History Month sessions. We talked about Shehigh Elementary, and we talked about Armwood High School and the vast history of what Dr. Shehigh accomplished. And we had his son, the other Dr. History, Dr. Shehigh, on there, speaking about his dad and his accomplishments and all he did. And it was way more than just a school being named after. It was a lot. All of our sessions, again, if you want to see them, they're on our YouTube page. I'm going to have Mercedes put a copy of our YouTube page in the chat again. And then Blanche Armwood, we had her niece, who is still living, and could tell us a lot about her history and their family's history, which is amazing. It's astounding. I never knew that Blanche Armwood and Armwood High School was, I did not know that Blanche Armwood was a Black woman until recently. And so these are the things that we want to make our students, our families, our community aware of. They're just not just named after the school, like Middleton High School. I would not have known that. So we want the world, we want our community to know that. So we're definitely going to follow up and get some of, hopefully, you might have to come back and talk with us, because you are the historian of Tampa. But if we can get the family members as well to talk about it. So I just want to ask you, what does Black history mean to you personally, and why do you think it is important for everyone to learn about Black history?
Black history and the study of Black history saved my life. It really did. And even though I had, I think, a pretty good career with the city of Tampa, and I was happy with the job that I did, but near the end of my career with the city, I'd say the last few months, I began to be preoccupied with thoughts about our local history. And I think the spark that set that off was a conversation I had with Bob Saunders. We have the Robert W. Saunders Public Library on Nebraska Avenue named for Bob. I worked with a community group, but it took us 10 years of lobbying and begging and pleading and fighting and crying. And we got that library built. I'm so happy it's named in his honor. And Bob would share things with me that he had experienced as head of the Florida NAACP. He was executive secretary for 12 years, working here in Tampa. Things that I hadn't given much thought to. And then it occurred to me, why would he choose me to share all these stories with? I think he saw in me a curiosity and sort of a thirst for more knowledge and more and more and more. And when I retired from the city, I knew what I was going to do, Black history. And again, the tours. I'd gone on a tour in Washington, D.C. several years ago during a family reunion, and one of my cousins had been a tour guide. He'd gone to Howard, and while he was at Howard, that's how he earned his money. He was a tour guide on buses. And so I said, I can do that. I can do that one day in Tampa. And I forgot about it. I mean, 20 years later, it happened. I was doing those tours. So we have to know our history if we want to move ahead effectively, successfully. Because again, there is nothing new under the sun. If we read enough and study enough, and even people who don't like to read, there are all kinds of YouTube videos and all kinds of things that you can expose yourself to that capture the history that otherwise, you may never even give a second thought to. So in Tampa right now, where we have this city changing rapidly, we can see neighborhoods almost disappearing. It's not the first time that's happened. So as we talk about gentrification, it may not have been called by that name in many other years, but I've talked to people who lived in different parts of the city, neighborhoods, communities where everybody knew each other, and they're no longer living there because someone else wanted to use that land for another purpose. And so either through eminent domain or some other means, they were moved out. And so that's history that if we studied it, we wouldn't be surprised by some of the things that are happening today. There's nothing new under the sun. It's all right there in front of us. We have hundreds of historic markers in Hillsborough County. Some people will stop occasionally. Sometime I watch to see how many people are going to stop and read one of these markers that have a lot of our history on the markers. But there are many more markers to come that will be put up. And I'm working with the group now to do that, for example, at the Zion Cemetery site, where we have hundreds and hundreds of Black people buried. Yet today, those bodies are still there. And we need to know that history so that it can instruct us as we move ahead. Never let that happen again.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. And we thank you all attendees for being with us. This was an amazing conversation, and I don't want it to end. We're going to have 12 more throughout the year, and so we're excited about the opportunity that we have. Are there any last words, Dr. Lewis, that you would have for Mr. Hearns?
I do have some final words. I would just like to say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your passion around Black history with not only our team, but our school board members, our cabinet members, our superintendent, and most importantly tonight, our parents, our families, and our community members. As I like to say, we could not do this very important work without you. And so what we are going to charge you with is continuing to send us other Black trailblazers and pioneers that we can have to share their stories with our greater Tampa Bay community. And I heard Angela at the beginning say, "in the world." And so we don't want to just stop in the greater Tampa Bay community. We want this to get out everywhere across the state and other places, that we are educating our community about the pioneers that have come through Hillsborough County, those that live in Hillsborough County, about the great work that has come through and that we're continuing to support and push forward. So we hope that everybody on the call will continue to engage with us, and please do tell a friend, tell a church member, tell a relative, because Black history is history. And we have a collective responsibility to make sure that we're educating all. So I thank you, Ms. Fullwood, for your leadership in this regards, and Mr. Hearns, soon to be Dr. Hearns. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, and God bless all of you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.